The heat didn't just bake the earth on that cursed patch of coral and jungle. It was baking the sanity right out of every man, and Sergeant Thomas Kellen was already halfway gone. The air was a viscous soup of diesel fumes, pulverized limestone, and the sickeningly sweet scent of decay that clung to the inside of your helmet like a second skin. It was late afternoon, the light filtering through the perpetual smoke haze, turning the sky a bruised orange, when the Japanese resistance finally crumbled on Hill 404. Kellen had seen 36 men die securing that ridge, but the one death that mattered, the one that had clawed the lining out of his stomach, was Private Miller, his 19-year-old radio man, blown apart by a desperate concealed knee mortar just 2 hours earlier. Kellen hadn't cried. Crying was a luxury afforded only to the dead or those safely stateside. Instead, he had bled the grief out through his rifle, an hour-long frenzy of noise and killing that left him deafened, exhausted, and fundamentally hollowed out. Now they were rounding up the remnants, a mix of dazed, starving soldiers and the terrified, shell-shocked civilian auxiliaries the Japanese command had pushed into the front lines. The POW collection point was a mess of mud and despair, surrounded by barbed wire hastily erected near the command tent. Kellen, functioning purely on adrenaline and spite, was ordered to assist with the searches, a task he loathed, but one that kept his hands busy and his mind just shy of total collapse. The paramount fear wasn't escape, it was the hidden weapon, the concealed grenade, the final act of suicidal defiance they'd witnessed countless times before. Every prisoner, whether civilian or soldier, was treated as a ticking fuse. The Japanese, indoctrinated with the concept of death before surrender, often concealed explosives in the folds of their clothing, intending to take out their captors in a final fiery embrace. It was this fear, this necessary paranoia, ingrained through months of relentless combat against an enemy who played by no rules the Geneva Convention recognized, that governed Kellen's actions. He watched the line move slowly, the interpreters yelling curt, brutal instructions. Many of the women were wearing traditional, heavily layered dark cotton garments, which were perfect for concealing weapons or anything else. Kellen ran his hands over them roughly, efficiently, searching for the telltale hard shape of a primer, the heft of steel. His movements were mechanical, devoid of empathy, driven by the memory of Miller's shredded torso. He told himself this was necessary, this was survival. But deep down, the rage was coiling, a poisonous snake tightening in his chest, seeking release. He wanted an enemy to fight, not these broken shadows, but the enemy was gone, replaced by this grim duty. The stage was set for a confrontation not born of malice, but of profound, unbearable fatigue and the searing trauma of recent loss. A perfect storm brewing over the makeshift prison camp under the darkening, smoke-choked sky. The column shuffled forward, each step an act of exhaustion and terror. Most of the women were older, resigned to their fate, their eyes flat and lifeless, having already witnessed the utter destruction of their world. But then came her. She was younger, maybe early 20s, her face smudged with dirt and soot, her long black hair matted. She wore a heavy, dark blue cotton dress, the fabric thick and perhaps multiple layers deep, characteristic of island clothing, meant to offer some defense against the insects and the chill of the jungle nights. but today it simply looked cumbersome in the 90-degree humidity. She didn't look at Kellen. Her gaze was fixed on the ground 3 feet in front of her feet, an intense, almost feverish concentration that set her apart from the others. She trembled, a visible tremor that ran down her spine, but it was not the wide-eyed, hysterical fear Kellen was accustomed to. Hers was a controlled, internalized terror, and it was this control, this refusal to show breakdown, that instantly triggered Kellen's suspicion. In the Pacific Theater, control often meant danger. It meant discipline, and discipline meant potential for attack. When the interpreter barked at her to stop and raise her arms, she complied too slowly, her movements stiff and guarded. Kellen stepped forward, his heart hammering not from fear, but from the residual aggression that hadn't yet been purged. He started the search procedure, running his hands firmly down her sides, checking the waistband, the shoulders. He felt nothing unusual until he reached her torso, just below the ribs, where the fabric bunched unnaturally. It wasn't the flat, dense weight of a small clay bomb, but a softer, yet clearly bulky mass. It moved slightly, yielding under his pressure, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, Kellen's mind screamed one word: concealed charge. He'd seen women strap explosives to themselves before, often in thick cloth belts. The memory of the explosion that took Miller flashed brilliant and blinding behind his eyes. Rational thought ceased. It wasn't about protocol anymore. It was about preventing another death, perhaps his own, perhaps the man standing 6 feet away holding the BAR. The paranoia of the preceding months had reached its zenith, twisting the situation into a binary choice: act now or be blown to pieces.
The air cracked with sudden violence, a sound far more shocking than any distant mortar fire. Kellen didn't draw his pistol. The act of drawing and aiming would take too long, and if it was a pressure-activated fuse, he was already dead. Instead, driven by the panicked certainty that the woman was reaching for a detonator or preparing to ignite the charge, he lunged. His action was purely defensive, yet looked horrifyingly aggressive. He didn't want to hurt her. He wanted the weapon, separated from her body, immobilized, neutralized. His massive, combat-gloved hand wrapped around the heavy cotton dress where the bulk was most prominent, just below her sternum, and with a guttural roar, Kellen pulled. The fabric was old, sun-bleached and weakened by jungle humidity, and it offered pitiful resistance. The stitching ripped away with a sound like tearing canvas, a sharp, prolonged rip that silenced the entire receiving area instantly. The material gave way not just in a seam, but across the weave itself, exposing the skin and the layered wrappings beneath. The woman gave a sharp, strangled cry that was instantly cut off, a sound of utter violation and humiliation, and she instinctively wrapped her arms across her chest in a futile attempt to cover herself, her body shaking uncontrollably. All sound vanished. The grinding of jeep engines, the shouting of the guards, the low murmur of the other prisoners, it all dissolved into a vacuum around Kellen and the woman. He stood frozen, his adrenaline spiked and then immediately crashing, staring at the raw edge of the torn fabric, the sudden exposure, the stark, horrifying reality of what he had just done. Lieutenant Hayes, stationed 20 yards away reviewing paperwork, snapped his head up instantly, his face turning rigid with shock and disbelief. This was not war. This was transgression, an act that violated every directive given regarding treatment of non-combatants and POWs. Kellen's eyes locked onto the now exposed area. He was ready for the steel, the grenade casing, the wooden handle of a blade, anything but what he actually saw. The bulk was still there, wrapped in layers of grimy white and gray cloth, now partially spilling out from the torn dress, but it was not a bomb. It was organic. It was small. It was moving. He saw a miniature hand, impossibly tiny, flexing feebly, followed by a faint, desperate mewling sound that was unmistakable even over the residual ringing in Kellen's ears. The hidden weapon, the supposed ticking time bomb, was a baby, swaddled tightly against the heat and the constant fear, hidden deep within the voluminous folds of her clothing to protect it from shrapnel, dust, and the merciless eyes of the enemy.
The silence that followed the revelation was profound, heavy with the weight of every wrong assumption made in the terror of war. Lieutenant Hayes was across the mud-caked ground in seconds, moving with the terrifying speed of a man realizing a line had been irrevocably crossed. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, dangerous growl, barely audible above the sudden collective gasp of the nearby soldiers. "Kellen, step away from the prisoner, now!" Kellen, still holding the piece of torn dress, was paralyzed, his mind struggling to reconcile the screaming fear that had driven his actions with the innocent, fragile reality now exposed before him. The baby, startled by the sudden cold air and the noise, began to cry in earnest, not a loud wail, but a weak, rasping sound that spoke of hunger and distress. The young woman, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks, ignored Kellen entirely and focused only on shielding the child, pulling the remaining fabric tighter around the infant, uttering frantic, low Japanese phrases that needed no translation to convey sheer maternal desperation. Hayes shoved Kellen backward, hard, the force jolting Kellen out of his stupor. "Sergeant, you are under arrest. Surrender your sidearm, now." The orders were clipped, immediate, non-negotiable. Kellen's training kicked in belatedly. He unholstered his Colt 1911 and let it drop into the mud, the sound surprisingly loud. 2 MPs who had been guarding the perimeter rushed over, their faces grim, and quickly secured Kellen, leading him away toward a temporary holding tent. As Kellen was dragged off, he couldn't take his eyes off the woman and the child. The sight had not only arrested his actions, it had smashed the hardened shell of hatred he had built up since Miller died. The baby was visibly malnourished, its small face pale and drawn, its eyes fluttering weakly against the harsh tropical light. It was a profound, shocking moment of clarity. This was not a weapon. This was the consequence of war, an innocent caught in the grinding gears of destruction. Hayes, ignoring Kellen entirely once he was secured, immediately focused on the woman. He called for a medic and the head interpreter. The immediate priority shifted entirely from military protocol to humanitarian crisis. The woman was shaking so violently she could barely hold the infant. The medic, a young corporal named Johnson, knelt carefully beside her, speaking softly, cautiously starting to examine the child without removing it from her grasp. The interpreter arrived, his face mirroring the deep distress of Hayes. The lieutenant's gaze, fixed on the exposed vulnerability of the child and the raw anguish on the mother's face, was ice cold. He knew the tearing of the dress would be interpreted by every man present, every prisoner, and certainly by the subsequent military inquiry as a deliberate, cruel act of dehumanization. But Hayes was a man who understood the difference between a deliberate sadist and the soldier who had snapped under impossible pressure. Still, the act itself was unforgivable in a disciplined army, regardless of Kellen's psychological state. The situation was no longer about security. It was about the immediate care of two starving human beings and the profound moral reckoning of one American sergeant who had mistaken ultimate vulnerability for ultimate threat. The shocking revelation had been the absolute absence of a bomb, replaced by the sheer fragility of life. The immediate investigation began swiftly, right there in the smoke-filled camp. Lieutenant Hayes, a stickler for procedure and painfully aware that this incident could escalate into a major disciplinary nightmare, personally interrogated the other American witnesses. Every single witness account corroborated the sequence. Sergeant Kellen, clearly distraught and operating under intense combat fatigue, had grabbed the woman's dress, pulled violently, and exposed the baby. There was no argument about the physical act. The defense, which Hayes intuitively grasped, lay in the context. Kellen genuinely believed he was neutralizing a suicide bomber. He had shouted a warning, and the woman's protective flinch had sealed her fate in his traumatized mind. But belief and fact were two different things when dealing with military law, especially concerning civilian non-combatants. Meanwhile, in the medic tent, Corporal Johnson was giving his report. The infant was perhaps 6 months old, severely underweight, dehydrated, and suffering from heat exhaustion. The mother, Kenjiro Aiko, was also close to collapse, surviving on meager rations and pure instinct. The bundled clothes, while hiding the child, had actually provided a degree of protection and warmth during the brutal nights spent hiding in caves and shell holes. Hayes sat in his tent, the flickering kerosene lamp casting long, restless shadows across his map table, reviewing the charges: assault on a non-combatant, conduct unbecoming an officer, if Kellen were one, but the spirit applied, and potentially, depending on the severity of the investigation, reckless endangerment. Kellen, held in the makeshift brig, a reinforced canvas tent, sat in stunned silence, the rage finally gone, replaced by a devastating cold horror. He kept seeing Miller's death, immediately followed by the exposed, whimpering face of the infant. The two images were irreconcilable, yet fused into one massive, crushing weight of guilt. He had been so focused on the enemy's death wish that he had failed to see the universal desire for life. He hadn't just torn her dress, he had torn through the last vestiges of his own humanity in the process. He had committed an act of unwarranted violence against the most defenseless life imaginable, all while operating under the justifiable fear instilled by total war. But does justifiable fear excuse a violent act against an innocent? The moral gray zone here was massive, stretching wider than the Pacific itself. Hayes knew he couldn't simply bury the incident. The American command structure demanded accountability, especially in the wake of mounting international scrutiny regarding the treatment of prisoners. But he also looked at Kellen's spotless, though brutal, combat record and the recent loss of his closest friend, and saw a man who had not acted out of malice or sadism, but out of a catastrophic psychological implosion. The true shock of the evening wasn't the violence, but the sudden, terrifying realization that the rigid, necessary dehumanization required to fight the war had just crashed headlong into the simple, irrefutable humanity represented by a starving baby. This was the moment where the soldier stopped being a machine of war and remembered, violently and painfully, that he was merely a man. The story of the torn dress and the hidden baby spread through the camp like wildfire, instantly becoming a whisper of shame and disbelief among the American troops. The men who had been dehumanizing the enemy for months, viewing them as obstacles to be eliminated, suddenly faced a stark image of the enemy's own suffering and vulnerability. The woman, Aiko, was moved to the small field hospital, the priority shifting to nursing the child back to health. Through the interpreters, Hayes began to piece together Aiko's harrowing tale, which was essential for understanding the context of Kellen's actions and the depth of her desperation. Aiko was not a soldier or a laborer. She was a refugee from a coastal village destroyed weeks earlier. She had been separated from her family and had spent the last 2 weeks surviving in the labyrinthine cave systems beneath the island, constantly moving to avoid the relentless American shelling. She confessed through trembling sobs that the baby, whose name was Haru, had been silent for much of the time. She breastfed constantly, despite her own starvation, and had learned to keep the child absolutely still and quiet by tightly wrapping him, knowing that any sound would draw the attention of either American patrols or, equally terrifyingly, the starving, desperate remnants of the Imperial Army who might steal what little food they had. She had hidden Haru in the layers of her dress because she genuinely believed that if the American soldiers found him, they would take him away, or worse, harm him. A fear based on Japanese propaganda and the undeniable brutality of the fighting. When Kellen grabbed her, she hadn't flinched because she was reaching for a detonator. She had flinched out of the primal animal instinct to shield her offspring. The sheer irony was crushing. Kellen's fear of a weapon of war led him to violently expose a victim of war. This context complicated everything for Lieutenant Hayes. The law demanded punishment for Kellen's act of violence, but morality, particularly when confronted with Aiko's profound suffering and the vulnerability of the infant Haru, demanded mercy. Hayes faced a severe dilemma: upholding military discipline, which was essential to maintaining order in a combat zone, versus recognizing the complete psychological breakdown and the resulting humanitarian need. He walked the thin line between prosecuting a criminal act and treating a symptom of war trauma. This required a level of judicial and psychological nuance rarely afforded in the heat of battle. He knew that if he threw the book at Kellen, which would mean a general court-martial and likely years in a federal prison, he would be destroying a man who was ultimately a victim of the very conflict he was fighting. Hayes had to ask himself, what purpose does punishment serve here? Does it restore the woman's dignity? No. Does it prevent future acts? Maybe. But the greatest shock was how effortlessly the brutality of the environment had corrupted a generally decent man. If Sergeant Kellen, a solid, dependable soldier, could break this badly, what did that say about the psychological integrity of the entire fighting force? This incident laid bare the ultimate price of total war, not just in body count, but in the complete, systematic corrosion of the soul. In a war designed to strip away morality, where fear dictated every move, did Sergeant Kellen commit an unforgivable act of cruelty, or was he merely a product of the total dehumanization demanded by the Pacific meat grinder? Where do we draw the line between a soldier and the survival instinct? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because the answer might define the meaning of conflict itself.
Hayes finally visited Kellen in the holding tent late that night. The only light was a single lantern, the air thick with sweat and mosquito drone. Kellen looked older than his 30 years, hollowed out and gray. He didn't offer excuses, just confirmation. "I thought it was a pineapple, sir. I saw Miller. I thought she was going to blow us all up." His voice was a flat monotone. Hayes didn't offer sympathy, but he offered context. "The child is 6 months old, Kellen, severely malnourished. The mother's name is Aiko. She was protecting him from us, and from her own people. She saw your gloves, Kellen. She saw your violence. You tore her last defense." Hayes didn't need to elaborate on the shame or the violation. The look in Kellen's eyes was sufficient penance. The conversation shifted away from the legal aspects for a moment, focusing instead on the logistics of survival. The field hospital was desperately short on supplies for an infant. They had powdered milk for adults, but nothing suitable for a baby, and the climate was unforgiving. This unexpected turn from disciplinary action to emergency childcare forced Hayes to make a highly irregular decision. He knew he could not release Kellen from custody without violating procedure, but he also realized that Kellen's immediate, profound guilt could be channeled into something constructive, a form of active, real-time atonement that might salvage both the soldier's mind and the situation at hand. The sheer shock of the baby's presence had been a psychological circuit breaker for Kellen. The sight had not only halted his rage, but had reintroduced a fundamental human equation back into his calculus of war. Hayes made a calculated risk, one that skirted the edge of military regulations, but was aimed at maintaining the morale and humanity of his unit. He informed Kellen that the formal reporting and investigation would proceed, and charges would be filed, but pending transfer, he was being given a temporary, unconventional assignment. Kellen's skill set as a combat engineer and mechanic was suddenly irrelevant. His new task was logistical support for the field hospital, specifically tasked with securing and fabricating essential items for the infant and Aiko. He would remain technically under arrest, under armed guard at all times, but his duty station would be adjacent to the hospital unit. This was Hayes' way of forcing Kellen to confront the consequence of his actions, not through cold steel bars, but through the overwhelming reality of human vulnerability. It was a punishment designed not to break him further, but to mend the moral fracture. The assignment was a direct line back to humanity, demanding that the man who had sought to destroy life now dedicate his efforts to sustaining it.
The first few days of Kellen's assignment were agonizing. He was effectively a prisoner, laboring for his victim, his movements shadowed by a grim-faced corporal. His task involved scavenging the wreckage of the island for any usable materials. He located salvaged tin sheets and lumber to reinforce the tent, ensuring the tropical rain wouldn't swamp Aiko and the baby. Most critically, he was tasked with securing specialized nourishment. The American supply lines carried only combat rations and medical supplies for men. Infant formula was non-existent. Kellen, utilizing his mechanical ingenuity, worked with the field kitchen staff to sterilize and refine canned condensed milk, experimenting carefully to dilute it into something digestible. A meticulous, delicate task, far removed from the brutal simplicity of pulling a trigger. He spent hours filtering water, boiling everything, constructing a crude but functional insulated box to keep the meager supply of milk cool. He rarely spoke, focusing entirely on the task, the silence amplified by the guilt that hummed constantly beneath the surface. Aiko, still severely traumatized and wary, maintained a fierce distance. She watched him constantly, her eyes narrow and filled with suspicion, the memory of his violent hand tearing her dress still fresh and terrifying. She only spoke to the nurses and the interpreter, communicating her needs for Haru with sharp,
desperate urgency. Kellen, however, never attempted to approach her directly. He merely deposited the sterile bottles and boiled water on a designated table near the entrance of her tent and backed away, acknowledging the gulf his actions had created. The true, shocking shift began subtly, not through words or reconciliation, but through the shared, overriding objective, the survival of Haru. One afternoon, while Kellen was constructing a shaded lean-to over the tent, Haru began a prolonged, feverish cry. Aiko was exhausted, unable to soothe him. The American medic, Corporal Johnson, struggled to quiet the child. Kellen, working nearby, froze. The sound of the infant's distressed cry was a visceral sound of failure, amplifying his existing guilt. Instinctively, without thinking about the surrounding guards or Aiko's glare, Kellen reached into the pocket of his fatigues and pulled out a small, worn piece of soft cloth, a scrap of an old laundry bag he had saved. He had cleaned it repeatedly, planning to use it to buffer the sharp edges of the cot he was building. He walked to the edge of the tent, placed the soft cloth silently on the table, and retreated immediately. Aiko watched him, her expression unreadable. A minute later, she used the cloth to wipe the sweat from Haru's forehead. It was the first act of acceptance, the first silent acknowledgement that Kellen's physical presence, though born of violence, was now tethered to life-saving effort. The soldier who had destroyed a shelter was now rebuilding one, both literally and figuratively. Lieutenant Hayes received the orders for Kellen's formal transport to headquarters in the rear for court-martial proceedings. He held the paperwork, stalling for 24 hours, wrestling with the ethical tightrope walk. He had included his exhaustive report on Kellen's combat trauma and the exigent circumstances, the belief that the woman was a suicide bomber, but military justice was often blind to psychological nuance. Hayes felt that while Kellen deserved to be punished for the violent act, the maximum penalty would be a greater injustice than the crime itself. He decided he needed to create one final, documented incident to solidify Kellen's case for mitigation, something that demonstrated profound, immediate remorse beyond forced labor. He walked over to the field hospital late that evening. Aiko was asleep, clutching Haru, who was slightly stronger now, but still fragile. Corporal Johnson was carefully monitoring their vital signs. Hayes quietly approached Kellen, who was sitting on a crate, meticulously oiling the moving parts of a salvaged hand pump he had repaired for water delivery. "Kellen," Hayes whispered, "I want you to understand something. What you did was an act of violence that cannot be erased. But what you have done since, that matters too. I've written my report detailing the cause and effect, the trauma, the misunderstanding. But the higher-ups want vengeance, not rehabilitation. They want a clean record. You need to provide them with something they can't ignore." Hayes didn't suggest what Kellen should do, but his intention was clear: make peace, visibly, tangibly. Kellen understood. He knew his fate was sealed unless something extraordinary happened. The next morning, before the transport jeep arrived, Kellen approached Aiko's tent. He was without his guard. Hayes had given the corporal 10 minutes for breakfast, a deliberate breach of protocol. Kellen stood at the entrance, his boots clean, but his uniform still stained with the residue of the past weeks. Aiko looked up, instantly wary, clutching Haru, who was slightly stronger now, but still fragile. Kellen did not speak. He removed his helmet, placed it on the ground, and then, slowly, reverently, he placed a small, crudely carved wooden bird next to the helmet.
It was an albatross, common to the Pacific, whittled from a piece of salvaged mahogany, a task he had undertaken over 3 sleepless nights. The carving was rough, but undeniably crafted with painstaking care. It was not a grand gesture of material wealth, but an offering of effort, of time, of focused attention on something beautiful in a landscape of ruin. He then spoke, his voice hoarse, the words filtered through the memory of his recent breakdown. He said, "I am sorry," the words heavy and clumsy in his own language. He repeated it in the rudimentary Japanese he had picked up from the interpreter, "Gomen nasai." He kept his eyes locked on the dirt floor, offering his shame and his atonement without demanding forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it.
The journey to the rear base was grim. Kellen was confined, but his status was strangely elevated among the men who had heard the full story. He was no longer seen merely as a brute who attacked a woman, but as a casualty of war whose breaking point involved a baby. The narrative had shifted from aggression to tragedy. When Kellen arrived at the divisional headquarters, the military court procedure was already set into motion. The prosecutor, a sharp, unfeeling captain named Sterling, was eager for a clean, cut-and-dried case. Kellen had committed violence against a non-combatant, period. Hayes, however, had done his job exceptionally well. His report was meticulous, including not only the witness statements confirming Kellen's state of shock after Miller's death and the justifiable fear of concealed explosives, but also detailed accounts of Kellen's selfless labor after the incident, supported by testimony from Corporal Johnson and the interpreter about Aiko's situation and the infant Haru's dependence on Kellen's improvised efforts. Hayes had even secured a reluctant, carefully worded statement from Aiko herself, facilitated by the interpreter, acknowledging that the American soldier had saved her son's life through his subsequent actions. The tension in the courtroom, a stifling canvas tent erected in a coconut grove far from the front lines, was palpable. Captain Sterling hammered Kellen on the violence, the disrespect, the potential for undermining the entire effort to secure civilian cooperation. Kellen, steady now, simply repeated his testimony. He thought he was preventing a suicide attack. He showed genuine, palpable remorse, something impossible to fake. The defense, citing the extreme duress of the combat environment and the proven neurological effects of continuous trauma, argued that Kellen was temporarily incapacitated by combat fatigue, rendering his actions involuntary. The testimony that proved most effective, however, was Corporal Johnson's detailed explanation of the infant Haru's critical condition and Kellen's subsequent life-saving logistical efforts. The court was forced to confront the irony. The man accused of a cruel act of violation was also the man who ensured the victim's child lived through the crucial early days of captivity. The judges, 2 colonels and a major, were experienced combat veterans. They understood the razor's edge upon which sanity rested in the Pacific. They recognized the pattern of trauma-induced overreaction. The decision, when it finally came down, was shocking in its leniency, given the severity of the initial charge and the public nature of the incident. Kellen was cleared of the most serious charges of willful misconduct and malicious assault. He was, however, found guilty of gross negligence and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, a charge often reserved for minor infractions, not violence.
His sentence was a reduction in rank to private, immediate transfer out of the combat theater, and a significant forfeiture of pay. It was a severe punishment, stripping him of his status and honor, but it was not the decade-long prison sentence everyone had anticipated. It was an acknowledgement of both the crime and the context, a rare, startling moment of mercy in the rigid machinery of war, secured not by argument, but by the irrefutable presence of a starving baby and the silent atonement of a broken man. The American soldier had torn the dress, but what happened next was the system recognizing the tearing of the soul as well, and choosing restoration over complete destruction.